I'm recording a quick take following a video I made a few days ago, broadly taking on the distinction between individualism and collectivism. That response video, entitled In Defense of Collectivism, was targeted broadly at liberal individualists, who I felt were using a much too simplistic model of human interaction and human valuation inside society. Now, strangely enough, even though the video was called In Defense of Collectivism, people might be surprised to understand that I do not consider myself a collectivist. In fact, I like to think I reject the dichotomy between individualism and collectivism, finding the difference unuseful for most practical conversations about human society. My intention in making the video was not really to convince everyone to become collectivists, but rather to point out why we shouldn't be individualists. Again, why that model is simplistic and encourages us to make mistakes about how we think society does operate and how it will operate going forward into the future. As I said many times in the video, my goal, my objective, was to help liberal individualists, to point out a mistake they're making, so that they themselves don't get screwed over by events that will happen in the future, so that they themselves don't make mistakes that will resolve to their detriment. But of course, a few days on, and I think that I have largely failed at this task. And while I haven't talked to Danny Duchamp yet, who of course was the author of the initial video I was responding to, I did receive more than a few comments in the video comment section explaining to me just how deluded I was, just how wrong I was to be a collectivist, to look at a group of individuals and see something more than their constituent elements, to look at a collection and ascribe qualities to the collective that in piecemeal did not pertain to the individuals in question. Now, I consider this something of a personal failing, owing to some much too abstract and simplified examples that I used to make my point. Initially, I thought it would be clever to use the corporation as the collective entity that demonstrated the value of looking at group value, but I think it might have caused more confusion than it alleviated. And I got many very predictable comments saying, well, corporate interest is just individual interest. If you decompose it to the base level, if you bring everything back to first principle, you can track every bit of corporate interest down to the individuals that compose that corporation. And indeed, there is some truth to this, but it misses the main point. These groups don't act the same way as a bunch of disassociated individuals. They behave in many ways as if they see collective value and collective worth, even if each individual thinks that they're operating inside their own best interest. Therefore, sociologically, the model of the collective becomes incredibly useful. Now, of course, as needs be said every time we talk about something like this, you can always take a model and decompose it, deconstruct it to its constituent elements and say that it's not real. But that does not mean it's not useful. And if we move from the task of deconstructing groups to the task of trying to predict their behavior, we'll see that the collective model is just plain useful. Knowing that a group of individuals are in a country together or in a corporation together will give us a different prediction about how they will behave in the future. And if we care about our own collective interests, or for that matter, even our own individual interests, that's a very, very, very important thing to understand. The individual model will make it very, very difficult to see that. Perhaps yet another better example that I didn't mention in my initial video on collectivism could be something like grasshoppers and locusts. Now, for those people who don't work in agriculture, who may have read something like the Bible or other ancient literature, might be surprised to know that locust, this scourge of the ancient world, this plague that is the ruination of civilizations and societies. These locust insects are almost identical to grasshoppers, and in some cases are grasshoppers, when grasshoppers behave in an individualistic type way. Now, most people know grasshoppers as a rather innocuous insect, a garden pest that really isn't a threat to anything other than a rosebud or two, or perhaps a piece of fruit that you wanted to eat. Yet under certain conditions that are not totally understood yet, these innocuous insects' behavior radically changes. changes. They start breeding at an uncontrollable rate. They become massively aggressive and start developing social characteristics, forming together into huge swarms of grasshoppers that can consume entire fields of crops in very, very short amounts of time. In this form, the grasshopper swarm, or locust, is incredibly dangerous to people who rely on limited local agricultural systems, since they can descend on a field and destroy it before any response can really be made to stop them on the part of humans. And of course, at an individual level, each of the grasshoppers is doing what grasshoppers do, landing on plants and eating their fill. But in the collective, with the collective behavior in mind, they go from being an innocuous pest to being a danger to human survival. And the grouping encourages this. What risk to humans is 10,000 grasshoppers? Well, distributed over the entire countryside, there's no risk at all. Conglomerated together in a giant swarm that's tearing apart your crops for the year. They are a deadly, deadly threat. And once more, it's not that the individualistic model can't explain this once it already happens. It's not that we can't take each of the grasshoppers in the locust swarm, cut open its brain, and show the hormones that are making them hyper-aggressive. Like I said, you can always decompose systems into smaller and smaller objects, but looking at the problem like individual grasshoppers makes it very, very difficult to see the threat they pose. It is very, very difficult for our limited human minds to understand what's going on. For instance, imagine trying to describe human rights if we decomposed humans into cells, and we decomposed cells into atoms, and we decomposed atoms into electrons and protons. Certainly each of those deconstructions is possible, but at the end of it, human rights are very, very hard to describe. What are you going to say? Well, this collection of electrons and protons moving with this kind of velocity and these kinds of spins, these are sacred protons and electrons that we can't possibly disrupt because of human rights. But those electrons and protons over there, that's just dumb matter. Do whatever you want with that. It sounds stupid, but that's what we are literally saying when we talk about human rights in the context of this incredibly deconstructed model of reality. Now, the obvious out I see from people in the comment section is to say something like this. Well, humans have minds, they have volitions, they have free will. Because we have this volition, that's why we can discuss rights and actions and responsibilities. Now, certainly there is something here. Like I said, there is a religious concept of value that we put on top of the human, and I think that's important. There also is a religious concept of free will that we assume humans have, that we use to construct our understanding of morality, at least when it pertains to ethics. But it gets much, much, much more complicated once we depart from this moral and religious perspective on the problem we're dealing with. Because despite what we might say in a religious sense, in a moral sense, at the levels of souls and spirituality and decisions, when we go to actual sociology, when we go to actual biology, when we go to actual physics, we understand that this concept of free will isn't so absolute. It's not like everything beneath the human, from the atoms to the cells to the organs, is subject to physics and causality and deterministic science, and then when we get to the individual, boom, we immediately have cognizant free will. The human mind itself is subject to realities that are biological, that are physical, and realities that are sociological. We are not 100% autonomous organisms. We do not exist as islands unto ourselves. We exist in a society with norms and traditions that are handed down to us. It's a common atheist trope, it's a common atheist cheap attack to say to Christians something like, well, guess what? If you weren't born in America, if you weren't born in the West, if you were born in the Middle East, you wouldn't be Christian, you'd be Muslim. As if recognizing that people had non-volitional elements to their own beliefs was somehow something that only applied to people who were religious. But guess what? If you were born in the Muslim world, if you were born any time before 1850, you probably wouldn't believe in individual human rights. I guess that means that individual human rights are simply something we obtain by brainwashing and have no justification whatsoever. Like I said, you can always deconstruct. You can always point to how an idea was formed in order to dismiss it. That doesn't mean the idea doesn't have uses, or that the model we use to talk about it isn't important. But I'm not here trying to deconstruct free will. The only thing I'm trying to point to is that there are systems, collective systems, societal systems, sitting over an individual that in many ways influence and sometimes even determine the types of opinions and actions that individual will take. Therefore, if we decompose everything down to the most atomized level, we will be blind to these overarching systems, these overarching sociological features of our reality that control and mold human behavior at the collective level, at the country-wide level, and at the intergenerational level. And if you're blind to these realities, you're going to get hurt. The same way you would be hurt if you were a farmer looking at a swarm of locusts as 10,000 grasshoppers round about the countryside. Even if you only care about individual good, even if you don't think there are collective values, this matters. Although I would certainly question whether anyone only cares about individual value. This would obviously imply that you didn't care about the generation that came after you. But that being said, it's important to understand this. And I realize that in making the initial video on collectivism, I probably left out the best example, the strongest example I could have used to demonstrate why this individualistic perspective on the world is ultimately harmful to individualists and liberals themselves. I left out the story of how liberalism got pwned. I'll let you in on a little secret, a piece of history that's not often discussed in the YouTube skeptosphere or in YouTube liberal circles. People complain a lot about progressives, people complain a lot about the SJWs that have taken over the universities. The giant setback faced by Enlightenment ideas in the educational institutions in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Indeed, these are real circumstances that happened, and they were caused by a force that we could broadly call progressivism. But people often forget that progressivism was not the force that really won culturally in between 1946 and 2008. It was liberalism. It was leave me alone, I have my own life individualism that won culturally during this time period. That was the truly victorious force in the 60s and 70s, and it certainly was the victorious cultural force in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. So that being said, how after 4 generations of victory by people who were all about individual rights and individual liberty could our cultural and educational institutions be so thoroughly dominated by people of a progressive, and for what it's worth, a progressive and collectivist persuasion? In short, it was a lack of focus, a misvaluation of what was truly important to society going forward. Liberalism hadn't answered key questions about norms, about standards, about group responsibility for the collective, about group responsibility for the next generation. As such, people entering the university asking themselves, frankly, collectivist questions like, how do we make society more fair? How do we take social responsibility? And most importantly, how do we mold the next generation? We're entering an intellectual environment where the only systems of thought that could answer these questions were the leftist progressive ones. Questions about the common good of society and the common good of the next generation are by their definition not individualistic questions. The individual won't be around to truly see the next generation. And of course, society as a whole and social justice is a collectivist construction. But the questions still exist and they needed answers. And because progressivism was the only force there able to provide any semblance of a solution to these problems, it inevitably was the force to write the curriculum and to redesign the systems directed at addressing these questions and addressing these problems. We obtained a progressive notion about how to run our educational institutions, a progressive solution to how to run our immigration policy, a progressive perspective on how we should organize our group and collective culture in this country. Were these objects ultimately unimportant? I guess on an individual level, they really weren't. If you were a person in the 80s and 90s who was an individualist, as we were all encouraged to be during those time periods, Seeing kooky things being taught in teachers' colleges and new strange courses emerging at the university level describing intersectionality really wasn't that important. These were just silly things done by academics. And what could be the consequence to your life right now? Not very much indeed. Similarly, the shifts in the mainstream culture at a collective level and the shifts in demographics could be dismissed for very much the same reasons. They were collective concerns. And when it really got down to it, was there that much impact to the individual life? And so on and on it went. As I will say again, it was liberalism, it was individualism that won the battle against Christian-oriented Western traditionalism, the ideology that had ruled the academy prior to the 30s. But in the wakes of the revolutions that occurred during the 70s and 80s, it was the progressives who collected the spoils. They cashed in on the victories that counted because in many ways, the goods that were to be conquered in the wake of the collapse of the previous cultural system were collective goods. They were institutions that gave you power over posterity and how society was organized at a very, very large level that really an individual couldn't care about. And of course, now we are in current year. And I think that even liberals and individualists see that the sword of Damocles is hanging over their head. You just have to go to the poll numbers. Support for free speech is way down. Support for freedom of association is way down in the polls. Recent college grads, and in fact, the demographic profile of this country as a whole, seems to care about these things less and less as each generation goes on. And what is the ultimate cause of these shifts? Well, institutions. Institutions that deal in and protect public and collective goods. Institutions that were ceded over to progressive forces when we all decided that we could only see individuals. And I think here lies the danger that I want the individualists to see, because we can talk as much as we want about how only the individual has value. We can talk as much as we want about how the individual only has rights. But in a realistic sense, these rights and these values depend upon collective public will to recognize them. And if we're facing down an overwhelming collective opinion that these individual rights, these rights to freedom of speech and association, don't have any meaning or worth, we are going to find in very, very short order that our individual rights, written down by some individual 250 years ago, aren't worth the Constitution that they're written on.